Great, okay. Hello and welcome to Looking for Bloomsbury's Lost Bookshops at Bloomsbury Festival 2020. I'm Nicole, the Admin and Marketing Officer at Bloomsbury Festival, but I've also done a bit of programming. So I've programmed the Strand of Walks, the Conway Hall Hub, and a couple of the now virtual walks and talks, including Looking for Bloomsbury's Lost Bookshops. As you may know, this year's festival theme is vision, ranging from literal sight in the senses, vision to the future, and to the hidden sides of Bloomsbury. And this is where this event comes in. I'm currently based at the very beautiful library room in Conway Hall, surrounded by lots of very lovely books, which is very fitting, I think. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Dearnley from the Institute of Modern Languages Research and Dr. Laura Cleaver from the Institute of English Studies, both from School of Advanced Study. Elizabeth will be giving a quick introduction to the talk and handing over to Laura, who'll be leading on the conversation, so I won't say too much about the event. Elizabeth will also be part of the Secret Diary of Bloomsbury Live on Wednesday the 21st of October at 6 p.m. So if you enjoy this, then please make sure to check out that free online event and book via our website. I'll pop the link in the chat at the end, so it's pretty quick. We also have a great programme of literature events throughout the week that might interest you, so please do check out the website. One last thing, we are recording this session, not for us to put anywhere, but just for archive purposes and things like that. But please drop me a message if you don't want your image used. And yeah, I think that's all from me. So thank you, Elizabeth and Laura, for being here, and I'll pass over.
Thanks ever so much, Nicole, and thanks to the Bloomsbury Festival as well for having us along. I've been doing events with the festival since 2015, so it's just really fantastic to be part of this year's festival. Everything's taking place virtually. So excited to be here from my bedroom in South London. So I'm not sure where everyone else is tuning in from, but I'm currently not in Bloomsbury. I'm over in Brixton. Anyway, I'm Elizabeth Dearnley, and I'm part with the Cultivate Manuscripts project along with Laura Cleaver. I'm looking after the event side of things. So Cultivate Manuscripts is a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council, and it looks at how the trade in medieval manuscripts in the early 20th century affected the development of ideas about the nature and value of European culture during this period. So for instance, why were some medieval manuscripts seen as more valuable than others? And how did the network of relationships between book dealers and collectors and auctioneers and scholars during this time period affect the trade in manuscripts? So exploring a lot of these ideas, and Laura will say a little bit more about a lot of these. So lots of the rare books dealers forming part of the project were actually based in Bloomsbury. So, of course, the area is really well known for connection with writers like Virginia Woolf and Lyshon Strachey, the Bloomsbury Group, but its history as a hub of the rare books trade is perhaps a bit less well known. So here to tell you more about this is Laura Cleaver. So Laura is a senior lecturer in manuscript studies at the Institute of English Studies, and she's also the leader of this project. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to her, but just a couple of housekeeping points before she starts. So there'll be a dedicated space for questions and discussion at the end. If you do have any questions or things you want to raise during the talk, just pop them in the chat, and at the end we can go through them, or you can ask questions yourself if you prefer, or contribute. Just make sure you've got your microphones turned off throughout as well. And latterly, if the connection goes down, just log straight back in again. It's very unlikely to happen, but yeah, we'll just open the event straight up again if that happens. So anyway, I wouldn't say any more, but I will hand you over to Laura.
Great, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you to everybody at Bloomsbury Festival for making this possible. When we initially talked about doing this event, we talked about it as a physical walk where we would actually take a small group of people and wander around London, trying to think about the architecture of the city and how it's changed, literally in search for these lost bookshops. Obviously, that hasn't been possible. The upside to that is that we can welcome far more of you without blocking any major roads, which is great. And it does enable us to look at some images that would be more difficult to manipulate if we were physically on site. Hopefully you will be inspired after this to get to London at some point and maybe do the walk or bits of it for yourself, or just to look at the city in new ways. But if you're like me, currently quite a long way from London, this is also a chance to think about a landscape that may be familiar or completely unfamiliar. As Elizabeth said, I'm currently leading this project that looks at the trade in a very specific kind of rare book, medieval manuscripts. So books that were made by hand, usually before the year 1600, although there's some flexibility in both the start and end date of the material that we look at. I'm going to talk about rare books more generally today, but my own interest in what was by 1900 an international trade in books is London as a centre of that trade, with a large number of booksellers united in a common purpose of selling books, but actually with different emphases, and all of them working with rare or even unique objects, trying to cater to often very demanding clients, and clients with a wide range of interests. So I hope you are sitting comfortably as we prepare to go on a little tour looking for evidence for some of London's rare bookshops. And I've chosen to focus on the first decade of the 20th century. So we're going to travel back in time a little more than 100 years. If we were doing the walk, it would take us about 45 minutes. So I'm informed by the internet. I think I will probably talk for a little bit less than that in order to give us plenty of time for discussion and questions at the end. As you will see, we're going to travel from Piccadilly Circus into Bloomsbury, skirting around the edge of it rather. So we're going to end up in Russell Square, and we'll go via some of the important sites for the book trade in this period, all of which have now either relocated or closed down. And as we do that, I'm going to use contemporary evidence from booksellers' publications, their archives, and court records to explore the close-knit nature of the trade in rare books at the start of the 20th century. So, to recreate our journey through London through the London of the early 20th century, I'll use maps from the website Layers of London, which is a growing resource, crowdsourced resource for those interested in the historic geography of the city. And the website address is in the bottom corner of the screen there, and you can check that out if this is something that you're interested in. One of the maps that they use is a set of Ordnance Survey maps from the 1890s, and I'm going to use those as the basis for our virtual walk today. And as you'll see as we go along, the sites of bookshops or related businesses, or their approximate sites, it's not always 100% accurate, are indicated with these little black pins. So our story begins in Piccadilly in 1902 at the bookshop of Bernard Quarage Limited. The Quarage firm is still trading today and has relatively recently relocated to Bloomsbury, having had several venues over the last 100 years. But in 1902, it was just off Piccadilly Circus. The business had been founded by Bernard Quarage, who had moved to London from Germany. But following his death in 1899, it was being run by his son, Bernard Alfred Quarage. Here he is in all his glory. So if I take off the photos of Quarages for a moment, you can see that the building, 15 Piccadilly, there it is, as it was when Quarage had it, and on the right as it is now, courtesy of Google Maps. And you can see that the building has been entirely reconstructed. So one of many sites where that's happened, but it gives you some sense of what we would be seeing if we were in Piccadilly now. As I say, by the time our story starts in 1902, Bernard Quarage Sr. is no more, and he's left the business to his son, Bernard Alfred. And on the 18th of December 1902, another bookseller, Frederick Denham, paid a visit to Quarage's shop. He claimed that he had an American customer who wanted to buy copies of the first and second folio editions of Shakespeare. This was a plausible story. Many Americans were building libraries at this time, and the first 4 earliest printed editions of the works of Shakespeare, known as the folios, were considered to be essential for any serious collector. The first folio had been printed in 1623 by Shakespeare's friends and colleagues, and the second revised edition appeared in 1632, looking something like this. Denham asked if he could take Quarage's copy of the second folio, as Quarage didn't have a first folio at that moment, to show his hypothetical American client. And Quarage agreed, adding that he wanted a decision on the sale within 24 hours. The price set was £720. Now, it's difficult to adjust historic book prices because the market has really overstretched or overrun inflation over the last century. But £720 in 1902 would be about £79,000 today. Last year, 2019, a different copy of the second folio sold at auction for £93,750. So that gives you a sense in which roughly what these books are worth now. And as I'm sure many of you will have seen in the last week, a copy of the first folio sold in New York for $10 million. So first folios have always been, on the whole, more valuable, but second folios were then and are now extremely valuable books. Now, in the first decade of the 20th century, there were lots of copies of the second folio on the London market, and the price could vary very significantly depending on the condition of the book and the exact version. £720 was, I think, at the upper end of what someone, for example, an American visitor to London in a hurry to acquire books, might be expected to pay. And there are also some stereotypes there about the idea of America at this time as a really voracious and undiscerning market for this material. Anyway, Denham leaves Quarage's shop with the book under his arm. When he didn't return, Quarage assumed that Denham had arranged the sale of the book and that he would be paid within a month. This was not an unusual arrangement, as booksellers often extended credit to one another. However, what Denham actually did was take the book along Shaftesbury Avenue to another bookseller, Frank Sabin. The building on Shaftesbury Avenue still stands, although it's now mainly home to restaurants. So had we set off from Piccadilly, it would have taken us a little longer to get up Shaftesbury Avenue than the wonders of PowerPoint have allowed. But we would see something like this, although probably today with a little bit less traffic. The building, I think, is probably the same building. It's just changed ownership and renovation, obviously, several times in the last 100 years. Arriving at Sabin's shop, according to Sabin, Denham asked if he wanted to buy a second folio Shakespeare, as Denham claimed to be short of cash for another purchase that he wanted to make. Sabin was not, he said, particularly keen to acquire the Shakespeare, but he gave Denham a cheque for £400 for the second folio and 2 other unspecified books, giving Denham the option of buying the books back within a short period of time for £440. This too was not an uncommon arrangement among booksellers, in which they helped each other with cash flow in exchange for roughly a 10%, in this case, profit. But Sabin, of course, did not know that the book actually belonged to Quarage. Even the most workaholic of booksellers, Bernard Quarage, annually closed his shop for Christmas Day. At one point in the 19th century, he seems only to have closed his shop for 2 holidays, Christmas and Easter, and then only for one day at a time. But in 1902, we have, after the 18th of December, an assumed Christmas break. However, Denham then returns to Sabin's shop on the 31st of December to repurchase his Shakespeare for the agreed price of £440, leaving a cheque which was later refused by the bank. On New Year's Eve 1902, Denham then proceeded with the Shakespeare to nearby Brewer Street and the firm of J&J Leighton at number 40. Again, if we were walking this, we might take a more efficient route, but for the purposes of storytelling, we will now just backtrack on ourselves. Again, it's not very far. These are all very close together. J&J Leighton had a shop at number 40 Brewer Street, which was on the right of the photograph that you've got in the lower right there. It's the modern building, which was, I think, pretty much a direct hit by a bomb during the Second World War, so has had to be entirely rebuilt post-war. But J&J Leighton's shop probably looked something like the buildings on the left of the photo there. Like both Quarage and Sabin's business, Leighton's was a family firm, and the current Leighton, Walter, specialised in book bindings and repairs. But he also followed the family tradition in dealing in rare books and manuscripts. And you can see his catalogue produced around 1902 on the left of the screen there. Denham now tried the same trick again, asking Leighton if he could have £400 for the second folio Shakespeare. Leighton agreed to buy it for £350, giving Denham the right to buy the book back for £400 within 10 days. Before we leave Leighton and carry on our walk, there's a further twist to the Denham story. When Denham sold the Shakespeare to Sabin on the 18th of December, he had claimed that he needed ready money for the purchase of some illuminated manuscripts. On that date, Leighton's ledgers record that he sold Denham 2 medieval manuscripts, one of which was this 15th century copy of the work of the early Christian author Lactantius. So it seems likely that, having obtained the cheque from Sabin on the 18th of December, Denham then went straight round to Leighton and used it to buy some manuscripts, or at least perhaps used it to show that he had sufficient credit or ready money to be able to buy these manuscripts. In 1902, Leighton had priced the manuscript at £60, but he gave Denham a small discount for buying 2 manuscripts together. The price for this unique manuscript, which, although as you can see is slightly worn, particularly in that wreath in the bottom margin, is still a very handsomely illustrated volume. It's always really hard to reproduce gold in photographs, but the thing that looks a bit sort of mustard coloured is in fact gold, and you can see the shine in the top margin a little bit there. So this would have been a very expensive manuscript to produce. And it is, of course, older than the Shakespeare book, but it was nevertheless valued at a fraction of the price. And this again underlines the demand for anything to do with Shakespeare, particularly in America at this time, which was driving up prices for certain kinds of material. What happened to this manuscript after it came into Denham's hands is unclear, but it next turns up at auction in London in 1906, suggesting that it continued to be traded between booksellers or perhaps went to a British collector for a relatively short period of time. It's now in the Charing collection in Norway. We'll return to the story of Denham and the second folio Shakespeare. But for now, let us retrace our footsteps back to Sabin's shop and turn towards Bloomsbury. If we continued up Shaftesbury Avenue, round Cambridge Circus, we would come to Charing Cross Road, which is still famous for its bookshops. In the early 20th century, many booksellers relocated here from Holywell Lane, an area to the east that was then being redeveloped. Among the booksellers that we would have found in Charing Cross Road in 1902 was Bertrand De Bell. He's shown here on the lower right of your screen, apparently in profound thought, holding his head. His shop has since been entirely rebuilt. It's where those very modern red buildings are on the left of the photograph, but it was a few doors down from the Presbyterian Chapel, which still stands. So there's the Presbyterian Chapel circled both on the map, and you can see that the little pin for Denham's shop is about 5 or 6 doors further along, and there's the Presbyterian Chapel still standing on Charing Cross Road now. In 1909, an account of De Bell stated that his shop in the heart of London is known to every bibliophile and is the best of starting points for one of those rambles amongst the old bookshops of the city in which the soul of the book hunter delights. Which is just to remind us that there's a very long tradition for rambling around the old bookshops of London, even if we can't physically do that today. In 1902, De Bell had an exciting year because he took on Westminster City Council for the right to display books on a shelf outside his shop. The council had complained that the bookstalls were causing an obstruction. The case went to court and De Bell was eventually fined the nominal sum of 1 shilling, with the council deciding to drop the matter. The London Daily News sided with De Bell, reporting that it is one thing to suppress a nuisance which palpably obstructs the path, it is quite another to suppress an ancient, picturesque and pleasant feature of town life in which a great number of citizens will miss like an old friend. In addition to selling books, De Bell was developing a reputation as a poet. In 1901, he published a collection of poems entitled Rosemary and Pansies, very much in a late Victorian tradition. One of these poems, the Bookworms Confession, describes his love of books. He wrote, "My crowded bookroom gives me greater pleasure than misers from their money bags can gain. Upon its shelves rests many and many a treasure sought for long years before I could obtain." I'll leave you to judge how great a poet you think he was. But later in the poem, he goes on, "The bookworm's passion brings no keen repentance, and if he spends, he still retains his wealth. Indulgence in it never yet did sentence a man to vain regrets and ruined health." A claim that, as we will see, Frederick Denham might have disagreed with. De Bell's diaries are now preserved at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And he appears to have made entries pretty much every day. Although the descriptions of his activity in the book trade are minimal at best, they record almost daily visits to auction houses in search of new stock, usually with grumbling remarks about how high the prices were. His diaries also record at much greater length regular trips to the theatre to see plays, operas, and the works of Gilbert and Sullivan, which together with his poetry seems to have been his main form of recreation. And he has strong opinions both about plays that he likes and plays that he dislikes. As you can probably see on the map, De Bell's shop was well situated for access to theatres, then as now in the heart of Theatreland. Some of these theatres, not all of the theatres, are still either in their locations as shown here or still going, but some of them certainly are, and you've probably seen the Palace Theatre built in 1891, which is of course still there. Bidding goodbye to De Bell from Charing Cross Road, we're now going to head south and east through Covent Garden to the Strand and the site of another famous bookshop. In the process, we're following a route De Bell could have taken to get to the Savoy Theater on the Strand, which was completed in 1881, where Gilbert and Sullivan's works were staged. The area derives its name from the Savoy Palace that stood on the site in the Middle Ages. It had undergone many changes since the Middle Ages, however, including significant redevelopment in the late 19th century, with the construction of the luxury Savoy Hotel opened in 1889. And ironically, if we were there today, we would see yet more reconstruction. I took this photograph from Google Maps a couple of weeks ago, and when I went back to check something yesterday, they have updated their photograph, which reflects accurately that this whole area is now under scaffolding and has been for some time. So we have the advantage of a rather better view of it here than we would have if we were there in real life, although in reality we would see a building site not unlike perhaps what you would have seen in 1902 or indeed in the late 19th century. But in 1902, a few doors further to the east of the Savoy Theater, we would have found the dealers Maggs brothers. This was another well-established family business founded by Uriah Maggs in 1860. The firm is also still trading with its earlier books based in a shop in Bedford Square in Bloomsbury. So this is another business that has actually moved nearer to Bloomsbury in the last century. And you have a mixture of building in this photograph. On the right is the entrance to the Savoy Hotel and Simpson's Restaurant. So these are buildings of the late 19th century. And then you have more modern building as you move towards the right. And as we'll see, all of that area has since been reconstructed. But Maggs's position, which was probably somewhere in the block where you've got cards galore in that photograph, was significant, not for its proximity to the Savoy, although being a few doors along from a hotel with a lot of rich customers can't have been bad for business, but in being a few doors further down from Sotheby, Wilkinson and Hodge, now better known just as Sotheby's. So we would now shuffle just a very few metres further to the east along the Strand to our next destination. Sotheby's was the major auction house for books in this period, and it was then on the corner of Wellington Street, which leads on to Waterloo Bridge. So it's somewhere buried underneath the block that's been reconstructed, but which has Tesco Express facing us. And you can see on the far left of that photograph, the one side of another of the great palaces of the Strand, and that's Somerset House. So again, that sense of a mixture of older dramatic building and some newer building going on as well. The second folio Shakespeare taken from Quarage by Denham in December 1902 had been bought at Sotheby's by Quarage in July that year. And so that's why I'm showing you the title page for the relevant sale catalogue on the 28th of July 1902. And you can see that it was a mixed sale with all sorts of things going on and the property of several different people, including such diverse things as occult literature, Cruikshank's works, coloured panoramic views, books of prints, illuminated horae or books of hours and other liturgical manuscripts, a collection of works on 17th century English literature, including, in quite big letters to again underline its importance, the second folio Shakespeare. Denham, Leighton and Quarage had all bid for the volume at this auction, but it had been sold to Quarage for £615. And there's a very bad scan, for which I apologise, of the entry in Sotheby's copies of their own sales, where you might just be able to work out that we've got Quarage's name written on the right. In this sale, the book was described as being water stained throughout, but otherwise a perfect and very good large copy. It was also described as being rare because it had been printed for John Smethwick, whereas most of the surviving copies had been printed for Robert Allett. The second folio had been financed by a group of 5 backers, all of whom had taken a share of the resulting printings, which had their own names on them. They hadn't had an even number of them, and of course survival had not been consistent across. So at that point it was believed that there were only 3 or 4 copies with the Smethwick imprint. There are now known to be at least, I think, 9 or 10. In offering the book to Denham for £720, having paid £615 for it, Quarage was therefore hoping to make a substantial profit from this hypothetical American client. Although it's unclear whether that was the sum that where he then expected to give Denham a cut of that profit, or whether Denham was going to then ask his client for yet more money in a bid to make sure that he made some money. As we've seen, all of this is hypothetical anyway. It's not now possible to trace what happened to all the books that were in the sale with the second folio Shakespeare, but here are 2 of the manuscripts that were also sold on that date. On the left is a copy of a work by an author known as Giles of Rome on medicine, which has not coincidentally found its way eventually to the Philadelphia College of Physicians. On the right is a volume of monastic rules, which was also bought by Quarage and is now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The prices paid for these unique manuscripts in 1902 once again underline the expense of the Shakespeare and the whims of the market. The Giles of Rome was bought for £5, 2 shillings and 6pence, and the monastic rules for £32. The difference may have been partly due to the condition of the books. You can see that the Giles of Rome is a little bit more worn, a little bit grubbier around the edges, where somebody's turned the pages, and the initial, which I've given you a detail of there, is a little bit rubbed, particularly with the face of the monk presenting his book to the king there. So it's not in perfect condition. The monastic rules is in rather better condition and more highly illuminated there. Again, you can't really see in this photograph, but there is gold where it looks like a rather grubby brown colour there, and there are more of these initials later in the book. But the price is not just about the physical condition or makeup and content of the book, it's also about how easily booksellers thought they could sell them. Book dealers ideally wanted books that they could sell quickly for a profit. There was a growing market for medieval manuscripts in this period, but that category encompassed a very wide range of unique books, most of which were much less familiar to potential clients than works by well-known authors such as Chaucer or Shakespeare. So I said it's not coincidental that the book about medicine eventually went to the Philadelphia College of Physicians. Booksellers were very good at trying to match unusual books with particular clients who might want them for various reasons, but often because they had some kind of connection to the text or the history of the book. Returning to Sotheby's, we can start to conjure up the environment in which these books changed hands from some contemporary or near contemporary images. So this famous image of a book sale at Sotheby's was published in 1888, but many of the people as well as the layout would have been recognisable in 1902. And Sotheby's was still on the same site in 1902 as it had been in 1888. Buyers sat around a horseshoe-shaped table with the auctioneer conducting the sale at a raised rostrum here on the left. The walls around the room are packed with books to be sold. During the sale, books might be passed around the table for further examination. You can see various people doing that, looking at books intently as the sale's going on. But most sales proceeded very quickly, dispatching hundreds of lots in an afternoon. In the foreground here on the left is the clerk writing the names of the buyers and the prices raised into a copy of the sale catalogue. And you've just seen a detail from one of those sale catalogues for the 1902 Shakespeare. Among the buyers depicted here are two men that we have already encountered, and get bonus points if you can recognise them. But here is Bernard Quarage, looking not unlike the photograph that I showed you at the beginning of this, and almost certainly depicted from that photograph, and a rather younger looking Bertrand De Bell. Another image of the same room, this time a photograph taken in 1908, gives a sense of the claustrophobia of a packed sale room and captures some more of the men that we've met. Again, we've got the auctioneer at his raised rostrum and the buyers seated around their horseshoe-shaped table, this time with their copies of the sale catalogue open in front of them. Now, following the death of his father, Bernard Alfred Quaritch has taken his father's place. Next to him is Walter Layton. Further along is Mr. Maggs, and between them is the bookseller I'm going to talk about in a moment, James Trageskis, famous for wearing a monocle. Other figures include individual clients who might be, or collectors who might be buying for themselves, and yet more dealers, both from London and from further afield. Some indeed probably from the European continent and from America, who would come over for major sales. In addition to bidding for themselves, booksellers would often take commission bids from clients. This enabled collectors to bid in absentia if they couldn't be present at the sale or didn't want to be, and was sometimes presented as helping to reduce the risk of dealers raising prices by bidding against them. At the same time, throughout this period, the leading booksellers collaborated on a practice to suppress book prices if there were no collectors bidding at auction, and this was known as the ring. Having kept prices as low as possible at the official auction, they would then proceed to a nearby pub and hold a second auction to indicate how much they might have been willing to pay, sharing out the resulting savings between them. This helped to spread the risk of individual purchases and was a very good deal for the booksellers involved, but obviously a very bad deal for anybody trying to sell their books at an auction and hoping that that might raise funds for them. So far, we've really been skirting round Bloomsbury, so let us now turn northwards towards our destination. This part of London was undergoing major alterations in the first decade of the 20th century. Our Ordnance Survey map from the 1890s takes us through a tangle of small streets towards Holborn. But by 1902, much of this was being demolished to create the Aldwych and Kingsway. Our next bookseller, James Dragaskis, put a map of the new road layout, together with key landmarks, including the Law Courts, Lincoln's Inn Fields and Drury Lane Theatre, on the cover of one of his catalogues in 1908. Through the wonders of technology, we can overlay that onto the Ordnance Survey map to show the arrangement that we would find today, with the wide Kingsway linking Holborn to the Strand. We can then choose our route to head northwards, and when we get to Holborn Tube Station, we're just going to turn right, and a few doors on, we would find the site of the Caxton Head, which was Tragaskis' bookshop. The Dragaskis firm was a prolific producer of catalogues, sometimes publishing more than one a month. Their stock was typically relisted in catalogues every 3 months. The catalogues often had images on their covers that projected a romanticised view of the book's origins. For example, in these images, medieval bookmakers seem to be showing off their products to potential clients. On the left, a fat monk or friar, and on the right, an elaborately dressed woman with a fantastic hat, which I sort of covered a little bit, even though it's clearly a fantasy. And these characters are reminiscent of the sorts of figures that you find in tales such as Robin Hood or the works of Sir Walter Scott, which again were very popular in this period. The books piled in the foreground of the image on the left give an indication of the type of books to be found in Tragaskis' shop. Early printed books by printers such as Caxton and Aldus Manutius, whose books are known as Aldines, and religious texts of the Middle Ages, including choir books, books of hours, and psalters. Another image used on the cover of Dragaskis' catalogues shows his shop, the Caxton Head, on the corner of New Turnstile, a street that not only survived the work of the early 20th century, but also post-war reconstruction. Well, just about. The building that housed Dragaskis' shop is, however, long gone. It was on the site of the New Look on the left of this picture, opposite the Superdrug. For a long time, I thought it was actually on the Superdrug site, but in putting this together and actually checking it out, it's clear that it must be on the opposite side. The lamp that you can see in the engraving on the right there presumably spans this little alleyway, New Turnstile. And the engraver, I think, manages to make it all look a little bit more spacious than it is in reality. Incidentally, as we're looking at this fantastic image of Tragaskis' shop, you can see that despite De Bell's fine for obstructing the pavement with shelves outside his shop, this continued to be common practice, encouraging passers-by to stop and browse. In a rather odd arrangement, Trageskis appears to have some very large books sort of hanging by his door, but around the rest of the shop is just a set of wooden planks on which are books. And you can see that the engraving shows us a gentleman pausing to have a look at some of these wares. Although by 1902 Tragaskis was trading as James Dragaskis, the firm had originally been called James and Mary Lee Dragaskis, reflecting the contribution of his first wife. Mary Lee had married William Parsons Bennett in 1875. Bennett was a bookseller whose business was based in Birmingham, but he started a shop in London before his death in 1886. Mary continued the London end of the business and is described as a bookseller on her marriage to James Dragaskis in 1887. At that time, Dragaskis described himself as a printer, which may help to explain the firm's fondness for printing these elaborate catalogues. Mary's involvement in the business was inevitably disrupted by the arrival of their children, first another James in 1888 and then Aldine in 1893, emphasising the family's emotional investment in the business as they named their daughter after a type of early printed book. Another daughter, Irmgard Anna, was born in 1894. Tragically, Mary died in 1900, and in 1903, James then remarried to Evelyn Bellwood Davis, and they went on to have a son of their own, Hugh. James died in 1926, and the remaining family continued the business into the 1930s. If we turned back on ourselves and went back to the tube station at Holborn and continued north towards the British Museum, we would pass the site of the shop taken by William Parsons Bennett, which passed to Mary Lee on his death. And that's the uppermost of the 3 pins that you've got on the map there. The other one that we've sort of skirted by was the shop of a business called Bull and a Vache, which is now pretty well unknown, although again it left behind some catalogues, and there's more work to be done on reconstructing what they were up to. But the Dragaskises had moved their shop a little bit further south in the late 19th century. A few doors down on Great Russell Street from Bennett's original shop in 1901 was the home of another bookseller, Wilfrid Voynich, in Great Russell Mansions opposite the British Museum. Again, a building that's still there. Voynich had been born in Poland and studied in Warsaw before being exiled to Siberia for revolutionary activities. He escaped and managed to make his way to London, where he joined a community of emigres and their supporters. Among the latter was Ethel Ball, an Irish woman with whom Voynich began a relationship. In 1896, Ethel changed her name to Voynich, and as you can hopefully see here, in the 1901 census, they claimed to be married, although they only officially married in 1902, probably to help Wilfrid get British citizenship, which he obtained in 1904. On his marriage certificate, Wilfrid described himself as an analytical chemist, which was his university training and background. But in the census records, he's described as a bookseller and bibliographer, and Ethel, his wife, or his partner, as a novelist and author. In 1897, Ethel had published a novel called The Gadfly, which became a bestseller. Her success may have enabled Wilfrid to develop his business dealing with rare books, although a later story claims that he'd borrowed £0.50 from a friend to start the business. Quite how he managed to do that with £0.50 remains unexplained. Wherever the capital came from, by 1900, Wilfrid had a shop in Soho Square, and in 1904, he moved the business to Shaftesbury Avenue, a few doors down from Frank Sabin, and, as we saw, in the heart of the bookselling community. In 1901, a newspaper article described Wilfrid as the husband of the author of The Gadfly. But in 1904, when the photograph that you're looking at here appeared in the Tatler, the headline was "Concerning a great bookseller whose wife writes good books." Yet, not to be outdone, in the same year, Ethel was on the cover of the Bookseller magazine in America, demonstrating the widespread popularity of her novels. The Voyniches courted publicity and romanticised their business. Wilfrid repeatedly told the press that his business was built on trips to continental Europe, where he bought books very cheaply, selling them to discerning clients for high prices in London. In reality, he also bought books through the London market, although he rarely bought books at auction in this period, perhaps partly deterred by the activities of the Ring. One of his customers in the first decade of the 20th century was Henry Wellcome, who made a fortune selling pharmaceuticals and founded what is now the Wellcome Collection. Voynich helped feed Wellcome's apparently insatiable demand for books, drawing on local resources to do so. In 1909, Voynich bought a manuscript from Leighton for £25, selling it on to Wellcome a few days later for £35. In 1902, Voynich was busy staging an exhibition of unknown and lost books. These were early printed books of which no other copy was then known to exist. The exhibition brought Voynich considerable publicity, but no immediate sale of the books involved. The collection was eventually secured by the British Museum in 1906. This is yet another reminder of the challenges of bookselling in this period, as Voynich's capital became tied up in stock. Today, Voynich is best known for his ownership of this manuscript, now in the Beinecke Library at Yale. Voynich obtained this volume in Italy in 1912 and spent the rest of his life trying to sell it in America. It's an extremely unusual book with images, diagrams, and a text, apparently in a cipher that has so far defied all attempts to make sense of it. In 1914, Voynich took this and other books and manuscripts to America, where he went on a tour of universities and museums. He spun romantic stories about his stock, including the cipher manuscript, claiming through papers which came into his possession, he learned of the existence of a large number of valuable manuscripts in Austria, which had been hastily removed from central Italy at the time of Napoleon's first invasion in the last decade of the 18th century. They were found at last in a castle belonging to a distinguished member of the nobility. Their existence was unknown to the owner. The chests in which they were stored had not been opened for over a century. This romantic story was later revealed to be cover for the purchase of the manuscripts from the Jesuit library in Rome, Voynich having promised the Jesuits not to reveal where he had obtained the books. Another London bookseller later told a less romantic story, possibly of the same event, in which he claims that Voynich boasted of having got a monastic community to part with its manuscripts and early printed books in exchange for a lot of modern rubbish, yet again demonstrating the many grey ethical areas in the book trade. Voynich liked America and settled in New York from 1916, dying there in 1930, although he returned to Europe every summer and maintained a shop in London until the end of his life. He failed to sell the cipher manuscript in his lifetime and bequeathed it jointly to his wife Ethel and Anne Nill, who ran the New York business. After Ethel's death in 1960, Nill finally sold the book to another dealer, H.P. Krauss, who, also unable to sell it, gave it to the Beinecke Library. Voynich's trajectory from London to America was the opposite of that taken by the Denham family. Frederick Denham, who, as you will recall, persuaded Quarage to let him take a second folio Shakespeare in 1902, with the story that he was going to sell it to an American client, was in fact American and the son of an Alexander Denham, who had brought his family from America and settled in London. Denham's shop was in the Haymarket, close to Piccadilly, where we started, but the family lived in Russell Square. In 1901, census, Denham is at 60 Russell Square, and he describes himself as an export bookseller. His wife Caroline is also there, and their son Waring, who is described as an export bookseller's assistant. Frederick, by this time, was married and had his own family. They were living out at Hendon, and he describes himself as a wholesale export book dealer. And as you can see, he'd been born in New York. Returning to the events of 1902, in court, Frederick later claimed that he had not left the Shakespeare with Savin on the 18th of December, but had instead taken it home to his mother's house in Russell Square. His father had died earlier in the year, and Alexander's illness and death probably contributed to a crisis in the business, leading his son to take increasingly desperate measures. Although the firm had plenty of books in stock, including this manuscript, Commentary on the Pauline Epistles, which was listed in Denham's catalogue for 1902 with an asking price of £32, if books did not sell, this caused a cash flow crisis, something Voynich encountered both in London and later in New York. From the court records and newspaper reports, it appears that the Shakespeare was not the only book that Denham had, in fact, pawned to other dealers in this period, making a loss each time he redeemed a book. At £720, however, it was probably the highest stakes gamble that Denham took, and he presumably selected the Shakespeare for its very high value. In January 1903, Denham was declared bankrupt, but he attempted to keep on trading. In 1904, he was tried for obtaining goods and credit after his bankruptcy, obtaining credit by fraud, disposing of property otherwise than in the ordinary way of his trade, and fraudulently converting to his own use property entrusted to him. A friend of Denham's came forward to testify that he had dined with the family in Russell Square on the 18th of December 1902 and been shown a rare book, but was unable to identify the book in question, a story that did very little for Denham's case. Quarage, Savin and Leighton all testified to their connection with the Shakespeare, and representatives of Denham's bank bore witness to problems with insufficient credit to meet his cheques. Denham was found guilty of obtaining a book by false pretences and disposing of it otherwise than in the ordinary way of his trade, and sentenced to 9 months' imprisonment. With the conviction of Frederick Denham, we've reached the end of our walk and arrived in Bloomsbury. To the rest of Russell Square, the skyline is today dominated by Senate House, built in the 1930s to house the Senate of the University of London, and now home to the School of Advanced Study, which includes the Institute of English Studies, from where I and my team are based. If you've enjoyed this virtual walk, you might consider making a donation to the Sambrick Fund, which enables us to support students to do more research into these sorts of topics. And the link to do that is on the screen now and will stay there. Our walk has taken us from Piccadilly Circus to Russell Square on a rather circuitous route via the Strand. On the way, we've encountered some booksellers whose businesses continue, including Quarage, Savin and Maggs, and some whose shops eventually closed, including Leighton, De Bell, Voynich and Trageskis. The tale of Frederick Denham has introduced us to both the close relationships between dealers who traded stock and extended credit to one another, and to the shadier side of the trade, with collaboration to keep auction prices low and a lack of transparency about many commission and credit arrangements. Frederick Denham pushed this to an extreme and ended up in prison. He was described in court as being very good at, in his knowledge of old and rare books, and very bad at accountancy. Denham's story also sheds light on the international nature of the rare book trade in this period and London's central place within it. The Denham family had come to London from America, Quarage from Germany and Voynich from Poland by way of Siberia. In creating a mythical American client for the second folio Shakespeare, Denham forged a plausible myth. In describing himself as an export bookseller, he presented his business as enabling books to cross the Atlantic. A decade later, Voynich followed this model by establishing a branch of his business in New York. Exploring the case of Denham's second folio also provides insights into the fluctuating nature of prices for rare books and manuscripts and the wide variation in price that might be asked for an old book. These clusters of businesses in and around Bloomsbury, fueled largely by both dealers and collectors' love for these objects, therefore provide a starting point not only for a history of London, but also for the global history of books and libraries. And there I will stop and turn back to Elizabeth, who I think is going to chair our question time. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Laura, for that. It's absolutely fascinating tour of Bloomsbury and the wider area, and I've certainly learned a lot. So in a minute, I'll pop down all the addresses as well, so people can hopefully follow it up in their own time, and we will be creating a map as well that will pop on our own website. I'll give you the URL to that in a minute as well, so that you can follow that. We're also on Twitter, by the way, so at cultivate_MSS. So we'll also, when we have new material, we'll be putting that online. So if you want to keep a track of what we're up to next, do follow us along there. But yes, now is the time for some questions and discussion. So I've seen a few questions have been coming in already. So if you've got any more, do add them to the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. So the first question from Jenny Maggs, she's asked, when we return to London, what bookseller would you recommend that best still has a feel of a shop in the early 1900s in terms of its stock and architecture? So Laura, are there any such shops that people can visit now?
There are. So again, depending on exactly what you're interested in, there are various places that still retain that sense of a 19th or early 20th century business. If you go to Mag's shop in Bedford Square, not only do they have a lovely display of photographs and bits from their archive up on the wall, but they're again in a I take to be a 19th century building, and that really retains some of the sense of an old-fashioned bookshop. There's also, and I've forgotten what its current name is, but on Marylebone High Street, the bookshop there, it's now a modern bookshop, but it still retains quite a lot of its architectural features, which again take us back to an earlier time, including a rather vertiginous platform in part of it where you can go upstairs and see a sort of multi-level effect. So there are absolutely places where you can still go and do this. And of course, there are still bookshops like Hatchard's on Piccadilly that have been on the same site for a very long period of time.
Fantastic. Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to going and have a look at those. Mary Rose McLaren asks, was the trade in medieval books as masculine as it appears in the images here? Or were women simply overlooked or not part of the inner circle? Tell us a bit about that.
That's a fantastic question. Yes, thank you. So one of the people who is named on the screen here, Natalia Fantetti, is doing a PhD on exactly that as subject, because the history of the rare book trade has almost always been written about as an entirely male business. But when you scratch the surface, you find lots and lots of evidence for women's contributions. And what Natalia is showing is that those contributions take many different forms. And what we're talking about at the moment is whether she should just try to write a history of the rare book trade that writes the women back in, or whether we need some more profound ways of thinking about what contributions are to the trade and how we value them. So Mary Dragaskis is a rare example who does get some credit during her own lifetime. She gets her name on the shop and on the catalogues, which is very unusual. But women make contributions in all sorts of ways. So one of my favourite collectors, who actually started collecting a little later in the second decade of the 20th century, when he moved to London, is another American, a chap called Alfred Chester Beatty, who married a woman called Edith Dunn, who was also American, but they met and married in London. And the collection, which is now in Dublin, where he moved later on, is usually thought of as his collection, but some of the most expensive books in that collection were bought by Edith as Christmas and birthday presents for her husband. So it's that sense of, well, what do you get the collector who has everything? Well, manuscripts are so expensive that even he thought twice about buying them. And the important detail to note is that Edith was very rich in her own right. So it's her own money that she's spending when she does this. It's not a sense that she's taking from any kind of joint account. So again, her actions have really been overlooked. Likewise, another very important London-based collector, Henry Yates Thompson, who was buying lots and lots of manuscripts in this period, has a much less well-known wife, Elizabeth, to whom he gives some manuscripts when she's very upset that he intends to sell them later in his life. And we know, again, very little about her collecting practice, but we can see in odd references in letters and diaries, we can place her at the dining table when groups of people got together to talk about books. So I think there's a whole history to be written here about women in this book trade, and Natalia is making a start on that, but I think there's much more to do, thinking about the very varied conversations that women, very varied contributions that women might make, financial, intellectual, practical, to the carrying on of this trade.
Got actually a follow-up question to that, really, for Susan Biddle, who says, did any women actually run bookshops in their own right, even if they only inherited the business from their husband? So it's obviously got Mary Trageskis. Are there any other that we know about who had their own entirely independent businesses?
Not that I know of, but it's still early days, so there may well have been some, and I will keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, it'd be great if we could discover some.
Yeah.
Anushka Fox has asked, will this talk be published on the IAS website as well? Yes, so we are going to do another recorded version of this that will be put on our website. So yeah, will definitely be a record of this talk that you can go and look up later. And again, we'll put it on Twitter when it's up. So do follow along, and it should be up fairly shortly. Great. So let's see, any other questions? Oh, I've popped up all the locations as well. Oh, sorry, Susan's also asked, I've only just seen this. The Marylebone bookshop that you're talking about, is it Daunt Books? I think.
It may well be. I think it's changed hands several times, but I can look it up.
Great.
That sounds right.
Yeah. I actually had a more general question, actually. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about the sources that you've been using to find these things out. Obviously, some of the things that you've looked at are sale catalogues, and I think I saw a census as well when you were trying to trace these people. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you've been tracking all this down.
Yes, absolutely. So the starting point for what I presented today was coming across really quite by chance the court records of the trial of poor Frederick Denham, whose story ends badly, which are all available online, not intended for the purposes that I wanted to put it to, but as examples of court cases for lawyers to study and the like. And there are other bits and pieces in the court records that enable us to flesh that out. What I love about working on the 20th century, and I come to all of this as somebody who previously worked on the Middle Ages, where the books themselves are often not only the primary source material that you have, but the only source material that you have. And you really have to pull together scraps as you can find them. Now, in contrast to that, the 20th century gives us a wealth of material and the ability to cross-reference things. So when I'd read the court records, which took some time because it's all written in quite complex and unfamiliar language, and inevitably witnesses give contradictory statements, and you have to sort of weigh up what you think they mean or meant, and how you balance them. You can then go and supplement that with details from the newspapers, which is great for things like De Bell's battle with Westminster City Council, because then not only do you find the documents about the court case, but you also find how it was reported, how the public engaged with these things. So newspapers turn up huge amounts of material. In some cases, we can then add into the mix booksellers' catalogues, as I've shown some, and archives, although not every archive survives, and some of the archives have yet to be catalogued and made accessible. Particularly, I'm thinking of Mag's Brothers, whose archive is in the British Library, and we're hoping to do some work with that next year. So you've got all these different sources, the books themselves, all kinds of different historical records, published and unpublished, and bringing all of that together to see where you are, I think is really good fun and enables you to make lots of interesting links and connections. And then obviously for today, the challenge has been to put it onto a map and think about it in a physical space, which has been revelation really for me in actually really thinking about how close some of these places were to each other and what it meant to go from one bookshop to another bookshop. Now that's really not very far in most cases at all. And you sort of think you know where things are in London, but actually being forced to put a pin on a map really makes you think about where things are and how they relate.
Fantastic. Rebecca W just mentioned Una Dillon as a female bookshop owner. founder of Dylan's on Gower Street. So I don't know if she's slightly later, perhaps. So we've got her as well. Barbara Hull says, not on Twitter, is there any other way to access the project? So we do have a website, so I will just, if you just give me a second, I'll pop that in the chat, trying to juggle multiple screens here, so just bear with me a second.
Yeah, the project's been going for, what, about 18 months now. So our website is growing slowly, in part because we're waiting for a major web redesign for the whole of the School of Advanced Study, but we are updating it all the time. So it is somewhere where you can go and check back to find out what we've been up to and learn more about where we're going and what we're finding.
And we've also started to create biographies, mini biographies of some of the characters that are mentioned, because I mean the people that Laura's talking about, they all have wild and wonderful personalities, a lot of them. So we've started to collect their stories together. So I've just given you that as well. So that's another place that you can look at some of the things that we've been up to as well. So let's see, any other questions? Jenny again saying that she'd been following the talk with her old style A to Z and imagined she was following us around. So that's fantastic. So really hope that soon people will be able to follow the walk in real space as well.
That's fantastic. Yes, I mean, one of the huge things, of course, that has changed in a relatively short space of time is the death of the A to Z. I studied in London more than 20 years ago, and when I went as an 18-year-old, the key thing that everybody had to have was an A to Z, and we carried them all around with us until we had a sense of how things fit together and where they were. And of course, everybody with a phone nowadays doesn't need that anymore. And I think that's just such a strange cultural experience that we've lost.
Yeah.
So it's great to see an A to Z getting an outing.
Yes, definitely.
And where it's terrible condition.
Any more questions that anybody has? Anything they'd like to comment on? I actually had one more question. Again, just sort of thinking generally, are there any further reading that you'd recommend to people if people wanted to read a book about any of this? So anything in particular you'd suggest?
There are some great things out there. If you want something both serious and academic but still very readable, I would recommend Giles Mandelbrot's collection. It's called Out of Print and Into Profit. It may itself be out of print now, but it's still available secondhand. A history of the rare and secondhand book trade in Britain in the 20th century, which is very wide ranging and covers a multitude of great stories. Very recently published, definitely still in print. If you haven't yet got hold of a copy of Richard Ovendon's Burning the Books, I haven't finished it yet, but I think that touches on lots of related issues around books and libraries and their place in our culture. So those would be the two places to start.
Fantastic. Lovely. I think maybe that's we'll wrap up there. So thank you ever so much, Laura. That was really fascinating. And thanks so much to the Bloomsbury Festival as well, and to Nicole for having us this afternoon. So I really hope, as I said, that you'll be able to go out in your own time and look at some of these places, maybe follow the whole trail. As I said, we're on Twitter at cultivate_manuscripts, so do follow us along there as well. So there's lots of things happening throughout the next week for the Bloomsbury Festival. As Nicole's just popped in a link in the chat, lots of other literature events going on. And yes, just a quick plug, my Secret Diary event is on Wednesday, so do come along to that if you want. But once again, thank you ever so much, everybody, for coming, and
for all the
thanks to Laura, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.